The thing Commander Mira Vasek did before the Voth fleet dropped out of fold space above the Bolzabar colony was hum 3 bars of a song her grandmother used to sing while washing dishes. She didn't know she was doing it. That was the thing about the song. It lived in the back of her throat the way old habits do, surfacing without permission in the quiet before terrible things. The colony's proximity alarm hadn't fired yet. The children were still in the learning bay. The hydroponic was arguing about tomato blight. Had been arguing about it for 3 days. A running debate about nutrient ratios that had begun to feel less like science and more like a small war conducted entirely in the register of genuine professional grievance. In secondary engineering, someone was playing a card game that had lasted 4 shifts. The ship was alive in the way ships get alive after 6 years in transit. Its rhythm settled into something that felt almost like permanence, even though everyone aboard knew it wasn't. Mira stood at the forward observation port and watched the stars. She watched them the way she always did at this hour, the same hour, ship time, every day for 6 years, with the specific quality of attention that comes from looking at something you still haven't gotten used to. She had grown up on a planet, had watched a single sky for 28 years before she ever went into space. The abundance of it still struck her sometimes. The sheer impossible generosity of all that void, stars in every direction, light from dead suns. The past arriving at the speed of itself. She was humming, and then the fold signatures bloomed across every screen in the command center like wounds opening in the fabric of space, and everything changed. 17 contacts, said Specialist Orendek from his station, his voice carefully flat. He had the quality of someone who had practiced being calm so long that the calmness had become structural, load-bearing. Configuration is Voth's second fleet. They're not hiding. They never hide, Mira said. She stopped humming. She turned from the window. The colony ship Bolzabar had been traveling for 6 years. It had left the Keldron system with 412 colonists, 200 tons of seed stock, enough fabrication material to build a small city, and the collected knowledge of 11 generations of human engineers packed into 3 redundant server stacks in the ship's belly. The mission had been planned in the last years before the Voth War became undeniably a war. Planned when the contact incidents were still being called incidents. When the diplomatic channels were still theoretically open, when the optimists in the Colonial Bureau had argued that sending colony ships along established routes was a sign of confidence, a signal to anyone watching that humanity intended to continue regardless. The optimists had not been entirely wrong. The Bolzabar had continued. It had continued for 6 years. It had been named after a word in a dead Earth language that nobody aboard could translate with certainty. The mission archivist had found it in a pre-digital cultural database, tagged to a children's story from the Baltic coast. Something about a train in a fantastical destination. A place you could only reach by choosing to go there, that had no fixed geography. That was somewhere between here and where you were supposed to end up. The mission planners had liked that ambiguity. It felt appropriately honest about what colony missions actually were, an act of faith disguised as logistics. Now it was hanging in the approach corridor to the Yathara system, 3 weeks from its target planet, and 17 Voth warships were forming a containment sphere around it. Mira watched them on the tactical display. Each ship was roughly twice the length of the Bolzabar, their hulls that characteristic angular fractured geometry that Voth vessels always had, like something had shattered and been reassembled by a mind that found symmetry wasteful. Bioluminescent blue ran along their hull lines in slow pulses. Their weapons arrays were not yet open. That meant something. It meant they were in the inventory phase, which Mira knew from 6 years of reading engagement reports from every Voth encounter the colonial fleet had survived. Open a channel, she said. They won't, I know. Open one anyway. The Voth did not communicate in the early stages of an intercept. This was documented. Thoroughly, bloodily documented across 11 separate engagements in the past 2 years, each one studied by the Colonial Defense Analysis Office, with the grim thoroughness of people who needed to understand something they couldn't stop. The Voth began with the inventory. They spent the first 40 minutes, sometimes more, depending on vessel complexity, in a scanning protocol so comprehensive it felt almost philosophical, as if they believed that truly knowing a thing was prerequisite to responding to it. Every signal the target vessel emitted, every life sign, every material composition, every energy output, every motion pattern down to the micron. The inventory was how the Voth made sense of the universe. Everything was one thing. Everything had a category. Every category had a fixed, predetermined response. War to the Voth was simply a matter of correct classification. You scanned, you classified, you acted according to the classification. The efficiency was stunning. The rigidity was potentially something else. Mira had read every engagement report. She knew what came after the inventory. She had 40 minutes, possibly less. She pulled up the crew manifest on her tablet and started making lists. The Bolzabar was not a warship. This fact could not be overstated and had, over the course of the last 6 years, only become more physically apparent. The hull was pitted from debris transit. The point defense batteries, 4 of them, positioned at the cardinal quarters, had been designed to handle micrometeorites and occasional space junk, not warships, and their maximum targeting range was embarrassing by any military standard. The communications laser could theoretically be overclocked to damage something at close range, but close range meant close enough that you were probably already dead, which limited its tactical utility. The ship's spine was mostly storage, mostly seed stock and fabrication supplies and cultural archive material. 70 years of human knowledge packed into self-sealing containers that would survive almost anything except a direct weapons discharge. In the lower decks, in the space they called the hydroponics garden because calling it the hydroponics bay made it sound less important than it was. 600 square meters of growing things were converting carbon dioxide to oxygen and anxiety to something more like peace, which was probably the most valuable function the space served. In the learning bay, 41 children between 6 and 14 were supposed to be studying mathematics right now, under the supervision of a teacher named Casimir, who had the quality of someone who had spent many years making frightening things navigable. In the medical bay, Dr. Yoon was running the daily diagnostics that 6 years in transit made more compulsive than necessary. In secondary engineering, the card game had just dealt a new hand. The crew manifest was 412 names. Mira knew all of them. You couldn't share a ship for 6 years and not know everyone. Their habits, their complaints, their specific laughs, the way they walked when something was wrong, the things they reached for when they were happy. She knew that Oren Dick ate the same breakfast every day and that this was his anchor, the thing he used to make the ship feel stable. She knew that the hydroponics lead, a woman named Celestine, was in love with the second engineer and had been for 3 years, and was never going to say anything about it, because she believed in maintaining professional boundaries, even in the absence of any plausible consequence for crossing them. She knew that the children in the learning bay had a joke they told in rotation every few weeks that she had heard 7 times and still didn't fully understand, and that its persistent incomprehensibility to her was something she privately treasured. She knew that among those 412 people there was a materials engineer who had spent 15 years building structures that could survive hard vacuum, a xenobiologist who had published 3 papers on Voth cognitive architecture before the war started, a retired choreographer who had joined the mission because her daughter was the mission's lead hydrologist, and who had decided that being separated from the people you loved by 6 years of transit was simply not something she was willing to accept. 41 children who were, at this precise moment, learning about mathematics. Mira looked at the manifest for a long time. Then she went to find Dr. Alinta Howe. Alinta was in her lab, which was organized according to a system that made sense only from the inside. From the outside, it looked like controlled chaos. Samples on every surface, reference materials cross-indexed by a color coding that shifted over time as her thinking shifted. Holographic open at 3 different scales, simultaneously showing the same data from different angles. She had been working in this lab for 6 years, and the space had taken on the quality of her mind made external. It was the most genuinely productive space on the ship. She was staring at a rendering of a Voth neural map when Mira came in. She did not look up. "How many ships?" Alinta said. Mira stopped walking. "How did you? You have a specific way of walking when there's something wrong that you're not going to tell anyone about until you've already decided what to do about it." Alinta rotated the hologram with 2 fingers. The Voth neural architecture glittered, pale and intricate, built of something that wasn't quite neurons and wasn't quite crystal but was doing the work of both. "How many?" 17. Second fleet configuration. The hologram turned. At its center was a dense cluster of interconnected nodes that Alinta had been studying for 2 years. The Voth decision-making apparatus, specifically the processing region that fired when incoming data failed to match any existing classification. "Do you know what this is? Tell me." "This is what happens in the Voth brain when they encounter something unclassifiable." She pointed to the cluster. "The processing load spikes, The categorization system freezes while it attempts to generate a new classification from first principles, and the entire threat response chain locks up. It's a fundamental architectural limitation. They built their cognition around the assumption that everything is knowable, that the universe is complete and finite in its categories. She let the hologram spin. The assumption works very well, right up until the moment it doesn't. How long does the freeze last? From the engagement data, and this is the most useful thing in those reports, the one thing nobody seems to have noticed, somewhere between 90 seconds and 4 minutes, depending on the complexity of the unclassifiable stimulus. The more genuinely complex the stimulus, the more ways in which it defies existing categories, the longer the freeze. She finally turned to look at Mira. Her eyes were very bright, which meant she had been thinking about this for a while, and had been waiting for someone to ask. You're not here to discuss neuroscience. I'm here to ask you what we can do in 40 minutes that would make them freeze long enough for us to move. Alinta's expression shifted into something more serious. She turned back to the hologram. The core vulnerability, she said slowly, is their categorical monism. The assumption that every entity is fundamentally one thing. One species, one purpose, one function, one classification. The concept of genuine multiplicity, a single entity that is actually simultaneously more than one thing, doesn't exist in their conceptual architecture. It's not that they struggle with it. It's that they have no word for it, no framework, no category. If an entire ship full of people were all, simultaneously, something other than what they're classified as, not pretending but actually being, in ways their biosigns would confirm, the inventory system would encounter a classification contradiction it couldn't resolve. Every person being two things at once. Every signal being two signals at once. Every function being two functions. Alinta pulled up a secondary display, numbers scrolling. The freeze window might be significantly longer than 4 minutes. We've never seen them encounter this particular stimulus because we've never produced it deliberately. Mira stood in the doorway and thought. Outside the small porthole above Alinta's workstation, the fold signatures of the Voth fleet were visible as faint distortions in the star field, like heat shimmer above summer ground. Alinta, she said, what do we have on the ship that the Voth have never encountered? Not just things they can't classify, things that are genuinely outside their technological and cultural history, things that don't exist in their inventory at all. Alinta looked at her for a moment. Then she turned to her reference stack and began pulling files with the focused speed of someone who has been waiting for exactly this question. I have a list, she said. I've had it for 2 years. Mira went to the learning bay next. She needed Casimir, and she needed the children, and she needed to explain something that she was still working out as she walked. The corridor between xenobiology and the learning bay was one of the longer ones on the ship, and she used the walk the way she always used long corridors, as thinking time. The Voth inventory classified people by function: pilot, engineer, medical officer, colonist. The classification was accurate as far as it went. But it was like identifying a piece of music by the instrument it was played on. Technically correct and completely wrong about what mattered. A person was not one thing. A person was never one thing. Even in the most reduced, pressured circumstances, even in 6 years of transit on a ship that had been stripped of every unnecessary ounce, people were multiple things simultaneously. They were their jobs, and their fears and their loves and their old memories, and their private jokes, and the songs their grandmothers had sung, and the card games they'd been losing for 3 days. They were angry about tomato blight and homesick for a planet, and excited about a new one, and frightened by 17 warships, and still, underneath all of it, themselves. Particular and unrepeatable, and containing more than any scanner could resolve. The Voth inventory had never been asked to classify that. It had classified ships and weapons and soldiers. It had never been asked to classify humanity doing what humanity actually did. Casimir was at the front of the learning bay when she arrived. 41 children in their rows looked at her with the focused, assessing attention children deploy when adults are trying not to appear frightened. They were deciding how frightened to be. Mira had learned, raising a niece through a difficult year, that children calibrated their fear almost entirely by watching adults. She stood at the front of the room and told them the truth. We have a situation, she said. There are Voth ships outside. A lot of them. They're going to scan us very carefully before they decide what to do. We have about 35 minutes before that scan is complete. She paused. I need your help. The room was quiet in the way rooms get quiet when they're actually listening. What kind of help? Said the girl in the second row. Short dark hair, eyes that were currently doing arithmetic on Mira's face. She was maybe 10 years old, and Mira had the impression she was going to be formidable about most things for the rest of her life. The kind where you do many things at the same time, Mira said. All of you. All at once. She explained it as clearly as she could, which meant explaining it the way you explain something to people who have no reason to understand the technical framework but every reason to grasp the essential truth. The Voth thought every person was one thing, one purpose, one function. What broke their thinking was encountering people who were genuinely many things simultaneously. Not pretending, the Voth sensors detect pretending, actually being. Multiple and real and unresolvable into any single category. Like when you're scared and excited at the same time, said the boy in the back row. He had the quality of someone who often said the thing everyone else was thinking. Exactly like that, Mira said. That feeling, that specific human experience of being multiple things at once. That is what we're going to do, all of us. For as long as we need to. Casimir had listened to the whole explanation, with his arms folded and his eyes moving carefully between Mira and the children, doing the arithmetic of it, understanding what she was actually asking. Now he unfolded his arms and said, "We'll need Teodora." Teodora Mach was 63 and had spent 40 of those years teaching people how to move in ways that carried meaning. She had worked in concert halls and small theaters, and on station, and once, and memorably, on the exterior hull of a research platform during a maintenance emergency that had ended with the entire repair crew performing something nobody had choreographed in advance, just found together in the zero-G dark, guided by her voice over the comm. She had joined this mission because her daughter Petra was the lead hydrologist, and Teodora had done the arithmetic of 6 years of separation and found the sum unacceptable. When Mira found her in the ship's small gymnasium and explained what she needed, Teodora sat very still on a bench, hands folded in her lap, listening completely. Then she said, "How much time?" 28 minutes. Teodora nodded once. She stood. She was not a tall woman, but she had the physical presence of someone who had spent decades in rooms that she commanded completely. And when she crossed to the wall intercom panel and opened a ship-wide channel, her voice was the voice of someone who expected to be listened to. "Everyone not on critical watch," she said. "Learning bay now. Bring anything you can make noise with." What the Voth inventory system encountered at the 22-minute mark was difficult to articulate in any language the Voth had. A ship. 400 meters, 112 life signs. The preliminary scan had been proceeding normally, classifications assigned with the usual speed. Pilot, engineer, colonist, medical officer. Standard colony mission configuration, the ship's systems all read correctly. Propulsion, life support, food production, fabrication, storage. Everything classified, everything in its place. Then the life signs started moving wrong. Not in patterns consistent with their classifications. Not in the paths a pilot moved through a ship, or an engineer running a diagnostic, or colonists in their quarters during a standard watch cycle. They were moving in synchronized clusters that formed and dissolved and reformed. Spiraling geometries that had internal logic but no tactical logic, no evasive logic, no function the inventory system could identify. Some of the colonists were moving in circles. Some were standing still, but their metabolic signatures indicated intense physical exertion. Some were doing both simultaneously in ways the inventory system's sensor array cross-referenced 4 times before accepting as a genuine reading, and the sounds. The Voth inventory had very precise acoustic sensors. In the first 3 seconds of the new scan phase, it cataloged 743 distinct sound signatures. Human voices at multiple frequencies and harmonic relationships, not the communication patterns of a crew running an emergency protocol, not the sound signatures of combat preparation or evacuation. Something else, something the acoustic database had no direct antecedent for. Percussion, hands on surfaces, feet on floors, something metallic being struck in a repeating pattern that varied just slightly each iteration, as if a machine was playing it but a machine with imprecision built in. And underneath all of it, woven through the percussion and the harmonic voices, a melodic line that transformed as it repeated, a melody that was the same and different simultaneously, that was structured and yet breathed, that behaved like a living thing. The inventory system began to rescan. In the learning bay, Teodora was moving through the children like weather, adjusting a position here, cueing a rhythm there, and the children were following her not as a drill but as something more urgent. Something they had understood from the moment Mira had explained it. The girl with the short dark hair had understood it first and completely, and she had started moving before Teodora reached her row, and her movement had this quality of utter sincerity, that made it more disruptive to any scanning system than any performance could have been, because sincerity doesn't resolve, it just keeps being itself. In hydroponics, the tomato blight argument had stopped. Celestine was clapping, not because she'd been told to, because she'd heard it through the deck plates and her hands had started before her mind caught up. In medical, Doctor, Unid opened the intercom to hear better, and was humming along to something she could just barely make out, her voice adding to the frequency spectrum of the ship's acoustic output in a way that required no calculation to be significant. In secondary engineering, the card game was still happening. But the players were also tapping the table, and two of them were singing. And one of them, Oren's cousin, a fabrications tech named Samara, who had not danced since she was 11, had stood up from her chair and started moving in a way that she could not have explained, and that meant something anyway. Mira reached engineering and did not stop moving. The radio had been in the Bolzabar's heritage storage since the day they loaded the ship. It was listed in the Cultural Cargo Manifest as Item 7441. Analog broadcast receiver, pre-digital, Earth origin, approximate age 90 years, 4 kilograms, vacuum tube construction. Operating frequency range AM band. Condition, functional, with minor corrosion at connectors. The mission archivist had flagged it as significant for preservation. Nobody had thought of it as a tool. Alinta's file on Voth technological history had a single relevant paragraph. The Voth had never passed through an analog communications phase. Their development had gone from complex biological signaling, chemical, bioluminescent, seismic, directly to quantum coherent transmission, skipping what humans called the electromagnetic age entirely. The specific frequencies of AM radio, the specific waveform structure of vacuum tube broadcast signal, were not present in any Voth technical database. Not because the Voth hadn't cataloged them, the Voth cataloged everything. But you cannot catalog a thing that was never produced in your portion of the galaxy. The signal simply did not exist in their inventory. Mira had read that paragraph 3 times, then she had gone to heritage storage and found item 7441 and carried it to engineering under her arm. Getting it connected to the ship's external antenna array had taken the materials engineer, a fabrications tech, 15 minutes of improvisation with cabling that wasn't quite right, and a running argument about antenna impedance that resolved itself in the approximate sense that they ran out of time and tried it anyway. The connection was ugly. The signal would be weak. It would probably only work once in the specific window they had, but it would be real. An analog vacuum tube signal broadcasting on AM frequencies, genuinely produced, not synthesized, into space. There was only one other thing required. Mira leaned close to the old microphone. The radio had warmed up the way old things warm up, slowly with a faint smell of heat and age that was itself a kind of signal. The smell of something that had existed in human hands for 90 years, that had sat in a kitchen in Lithuania, while a woman washed dishes and sang. She didn't know the radio's history. She didn't know whose hands had held it before it became an artifact. She knew only that it was real and old, and that what she was about to put into it was real and old in the same way. She hummed 3 bars, the same 3 bars. The ones that lived in the back of her throat. The carrier wave took the sound and pushed it outward, through the antenna array, through the hull of the ship, out into the vacuum where the Voth fleet was sitting in its sphere doing its third rescan of a vessel that kept generating new categories faster than the inventory system could resolve them. The Voth acoustic sensors registered the new signal, cross-referenced it against the broadcast database, found no match. Cross-referenced against the known signal archive, found no match, generated a new classification attempt. The new classification attempt required 11 parameters to resolve, and 3 of those parameters had no existing values. The inventory system locked. Alinta had told her 4 minutes was the theoretical maximum. She had been working from incomplete data on an unprecedented stimulus. The actual freeze lasted 11 minutes and 40 seconds. In 11 minutes and 40 seconds, a colony ship under sublights in the approach corridor of the Yathara system covers approximately 40,000 kilometers. 40,000 kilometers changes the geometry of an intercept when there is a gas giant in the approach corridor, a planet 11 times the mass of Jupiter, with a debris field that extended 60,000 kilometers beyond its equatorial ring. 40,000 kilometers was not quite enough to reach the debris field, but it was enough to change angles. Put the gas giant's gravity well between the Bolzabar and the optimal intercept corridor. When the Voth inventory system completed its 4th reclassification attempt and the threat response chain came back online, the Bolzabar was no longer in the position the intercept geometry had anticipated. The Voth could recalculate. They did recalculate. But recalculating against a ship that was already entering the debris field was a different problem than intercepting a ship in open space. The debris field was old and thick and chaotic in the way that planetary ring debris always is. Not so dense as to be impassable, but dense enough that targeting solutions required constant updating. And the Bolzabar's hull, already pitted from 6 years of transit, read against the background clutter of the debris in ways that made the inventory system work hard to maintain a fix. The Voth searched for 6 hours. Then they found the signal. It was still broadcasting. The radio was still on, still warm, still pushing its carrier wave out through the antenna array. The melodic fragment that Mira had hummed into it was long gone into the vacuum, but the signal itself persisted, analog and strange, at a frequency the Voth had no category for. The fleet spent 3 hours analyzing it. They could not determine its nature, weapon, decoy, communication, or something with no function analog in their system. They logged it as unclassified contact and withdrew. Mira was on the observation deck when Oren told her. She had been there for 2 hours, sitting on the floor with her back against the bulkhead, which was not the posture of a commanding officer, but was the posture of someone who had been standing for a long time and whose legs had reached a firm conclusion. Someone, she thought it was Casimir, who had a gift for appearing with the right thing at the right moment, had pressed a cup of hot tea into her hands at some point. She was watching the debris field turn in the light of the distant sun. They logged the whole engagement as an anomalous contact, Oren said. He was standing behind her, and his voice had the slightly stunned quality of a man updating his model of what was possible. The ship, the signal, everything. Filed as vessel exhibiting unclassifiable behavioral patterns, unclassifiable signal output, recommend further analysis before engagement. Good, Mira said. We confused 17 Voth warships with music and a vacuum tube radio. And the dancing. He was quiet for a moment. Commander, what does this mean? For the war. What do we do with this? Mira looked at the debris field. It was beautiful in the specific way that asteroid fields are beautiful. Not the organized beauty of designed things, but the accidental beauty of matter that has been through something and is still here. Rocks that had once been a planet, or part of one, distributed by some ancient violence into a pattern that looked like chaos but had its own physics, its own deep logic. It means we've been fighting on their terms, she said. Ships against ships, weapons against weapons, classification against classification. Every time we meet them that way, we feed the inventory. We give them data they already have frameworks for. We make ourselves legible. She drank the tea. It was real tea, which meant the ceremonial reserves, which meant Casimir had decided this qualified as a ceremony. She agreed with him. What they can't handle is what we actually are. She thought about the children, about the girl with the measuring eyes who had understood before the explanation was finished, about the boy who had articulated the essential truth of it, scared and excited at the same time, in 8 words. About Theodora moving through the learning bay like weather, and the way the rhythm had spread through the ship, not as an order, but as something that found people and moved into them, the way music does. About Sistine clapping before her mind caught up with her hands. About Samara in secondary engineering, standing up from a card game to do something she couldn't have explained. We have 3 weeks to Yathara, Mira said. I want Alinta to start a project, a library, everything we do that they can't classify. Every behavior, every practice, every piece of culture that exists nowhere in their inventory. Not just what we did today was improvised. I want it documented, studied, refined. I want to understand exactly what we are that they can't parse, and I want a library of it. For what purpose? She considered the question seriously. Survival, initially. But beyond that, I'm not sure yet. She thought of 11 minutes and 40 seconds. She thought of the 4 minutes Alinta had predicted and the 11 they'd gotten, and what the gap between those numbers suggested about what was possible with a more deliberate approach. There are other colony ships out there. There are other settlements, other stations, other ships that the Voth are cataloging right now. If we could give them something to add to what the Voth have already filed. If the Voth are already carrying an anomalous contact report on us, then anything that matches our signal, our pattern, anything that reads as the same kind of unclassifiable, gets filed alongside us, gets treated as the same kind of anomaly, and the inventory doesn't escalate against anomalies the way it escalates against threats. It waits, it tries to understand. That's our window. She set the cup down. We have to be worth not understanding. Oren was quiet for a long time. The debris field turned. That's not a war plan, he said finally. No, Mira agreed. It's something older than a war plan. I'm not sure we have a word for it. They reached Yathara in 22 days. The planet was better than the surveys had projected. Greener, wetter, the atmosphere slightly richer in oxygen than the models had promised, the soil profile deeper and more varied. The first geological scans from orbit showed a continent that looked, in the way that all continents look from orbit, like something that had been made rather than formed. An impossible impression that the planet always gave before you came down to it, and found it was simply rock and water and time, doing what they did. They made landfall on the 4th day in orbit, after the standard site assessment, after the biological clearance, after all the protocols that stood between a planet and the people who were going to call it home. The habitat assembly took 3 days. On the morning after the first full night in the habitat, Mira walked out alone before the colony woke up and stood on ground that had never felt a human footstep and looked at a sky that was a slightly different blue than she had grown up with, a slightly different quality of light, and she breathed the alien air and felt the alien gravity and thought, this is the place we were always going to end up. The colony woke up slowly as it always did, ship rhythms translating awkwardly into planetary ones. Children came out first because children always did, drawn by the novelty of real ground underfoot and a horizon that didn't end at a bulkhead. Casimir was already outside, already looking up, his binoculars out, already finding birds. There were birds, or things that functioned as birds, things that flew and made sounds and moved through air in the specific purposeful way of creatures that had long since figured out something humans were still working on. He was already cataloging them in the small notebook he carried for the purpose. Within a week, he would know their patterns. Within 2 weeks, he would be attempting to call them. Theodora was teaching her daughter Petra a foot sequence on the flat ground outside the habitat entrance. Petra kept getting the weight shift wrong, kept correcting it, kept getting it wrong in the same way that learning works. The wrong and the correction and the wrong again, slightly different each time, spiraling towards something. They were laughing. The laughter had the quality of laughter between people who know each other so well that being bad at something together is its own form of intimacy. Alinta had set up her equipment in the survey shelter and was already talking to herself in the dense, rapid shorthand she used when excited, her scanner reading the local ecology and generating more questions than it answered, which was exactly what first contact planetology looked like when it was working properly. Oren had found a flat rock at the edge of the largest water body. A lake, they were calling it a lake, though it was technically an inland sea, and was sitting on it doing nothing at all. This was the most productive thing Mira had seen him do in 6 years. She did not disturb him. The children were everywhere, learning the ground, learning the air, learning the specific quality of this world's wind, which came off the water in long, smooth pushes that felt nothing like recycled ship air, and everything like something that had traveled from somewhere to reach you. Mira watched all of it and felt the thing she had no precise word for, between wonder and gratitude and grief and something else, something that had no name but that she recognized anyway. The feeling of a place being entered, of a chapter being written, of an ordinary, extraordinary morning becoming part of the record of what happened here. She hummed 3 bars. She hadn't decided to. The song was just there, in the back of her throat, where it always was, the small, warm coal that nothing had ever managed to extinguish. The girl with the short, dark hair, she was called Lena, Mira had learned. She was 10 years old, and she already had a notebook of her own, for cataloging things she found. Looked up from the grass where she was crouching. She was maybe 15 meters away. She looked at Mira with those measuring eyes, then she hummed back. The same 3 bars. She had the pitch slightly wrong but the shape exactly right. The shape of the melody, its rise and its pause, and the way it resolved. She had heard it 3 weeks ago on a ship running from a Voth fleet, echoing through the audio system while everyone on board was also singing something else. And she had kept it the way children keep things they recognize as important without being able to articulate why. Person to person, body to body, one voice to another, the thing itself traveling. Mira stood on new ground and listened to a 10-year-old hum a melody from a dead woman's kitchen, on a planet no human had ever touched, and thought about the library she was going to build. The Voth would come eventually. They came everywhere in the end. They would scan this world and find a colony of human beings doing what human beings did, building things and arguing and teaching and laughing, and being simultaneously afraid and brave, simultaneously things and one thing, simultaneously what they were classified as, and something more, something adjacent, something the inventory system would keep trying to resolve and keep failing to resolve because it was looking for the wrong kind of resolution. She hoped they would find it as confusing as the debris field. She was going to help make sure they did. She was already building the library. She had been building it her whole life without knowing. Every song learned and passed on. Every dance taught to someone who taught it to someone else. Every moment of being multiple things at once. Every human instant of I don't know what I am right now, but I'm still here. All of it. The whole irreducible catalog of being human, which was not a catalog, which was precisely the point, which was the one thing the Voth would never be able to file and could never stop trying to. She kept humming. The girl kept humming. Somewhere behind them, Casimir had found a bird.